Years ago, when I'd tell people that I'm an atheist and a Tolkien fan, I'd get some strange looks, almost as bad as the ones I'd get from people who think I'm ugly. These days, it's pretty rare that I get that reaction. Well, not the "you're ugly" reaction, I still get that. And it probably has a lot to do with both the popularity of the movies, of which I am not a fan, by the way, and the slowly growing atheist movement. However accepting they might be nowadays of unusual fans like me, most people don't realize that, despite being very religious and a devout Catholic, Tolkien's writing was not completely devoid of ideas we atheists can relate to and embrace. Now, to be fair, you really have to dig for these ideas. They are not legion by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're compelling enough to warrant a video analysis. Before we dive in here, I'm going to say right off the bat that some of you devoted Tolkien fans will almost certainly recognize a few of the points I bring up. It's stuff you've seen debated in Tolkien forums for years, such as what distinguishes him from C.S. Lewis, but I hope to cover some things that even the most diehard among you may not have considered, and a couple things some of you would never have considered. As a consequence, you're not going to agree with every interpretation put forth in this video, but you know what they say about pleasing everyone. And remember, this is mostly in the spirit of good fun and looking at an old work in a new way. Oh, and the title of this video only mentions The Lord of the Rings, but we're also going to be talking about the Silmarillion. Well, enough babble, let's get to it. One of the strongest instincts Tolkien had as a writer is that less is more. A certain filmmaker, who shall remain nameless, because I'm a nice guy, could benefit greatly from this simple artistic principle. Unlike C.S. Lewis, whose Aslan character was a fairly obvious representation of Jesus Christ, Tolkien didn't let his faith interfere with his intuition that it's best to avoid glaring and blatant symbolism. But here are the words of Tolkien himself on the matter from the book The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. I have purposely kept allusions to the highest matters down to mere hints, perceptible only by the most attentive, or kept them under unexplained symbolic forms. So God and the angelic gods, the lords or powers of the West, only peep through in such places as Gandalf's conversation with Frodo. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ringmakers. Or in Faramir's Númenórean grace at dinner. In that last bit there, Tolkien is talking about Faramir and his men bowing to the west before their meal in Henneth Annwn, which you could be forgiven for mistaking as deference to Númenor solely rather than Valinor instead or as well. Whether or not he practiced this restraint to avoid scaring away the non-believers in his audience is open for debate. That it is a more popular and preferable style to the conspicuous preaching of C.S. Lewis is not. Or at least so say the book sales.
But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. And straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. Then Iluvatar arose, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. And suddenly the Ainur saw afar off a light, as it were a cloud with a living heart of flame, and they knew that this was no vision only, but that Iluvatar had made a new thing, Ea, the world that is. Thus it came to pass that of the Ainur some abode still with Iluvatar beyond the confines of the world. But others, and among them many of the greatest and most fair, took the leave of Iluvatar and descended into it. And therefore they are named the Valar, the powers of the world. The chief part was taken by Manwe, and Aule, and Ulmo. But Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it, if he might, to his own desires and purposes, and he kindled great fires. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, "This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself." Thus began the first battle of the Valar with Melkor for the dominion of Arda, that the Valar endeavoured ever, in despite of Melkor, to rule the earth and to prepare it for the coming of the firstborn. And they built lands, and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved, and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved, and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed, and Melkor spilled them. And naught might have peace or come to lasting growth, for as surely as the Valar began a labour, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it. And yet their labour was not all in vain. And though nowhere and in no work was their will and purpose wholly fulfilled, and all things were in hue and shape other than the Valar had at first intended, slowly nonetheless the earth was fashioned and made firm. And thus was the habitation of the children of Iluvatar established at last in the deeps of time, and amidst the innumerable stars.
Try not to let the disappointment of transitioning from Martin Shaw's mellifluous booming pipes to my crappy voice ruin your appreciation of the points raised in this video. When you read the Silmarillion or listen to the audiobook, it will almost certainly at times remind you of real-world scripture or mythologies such as the Bible or Greek and Nordic legends. This is not some happy or unhappy coincidence or mistake. One of Tolkien's goals for these stories was that they become the first mythology ever written in English. So the question is, why do stories like Lucifer's and the revolt from the rule of an almighty god even enter into religious fables? How the heck could a less powerful being ever hope to succeed in the face of omnipotence? And why do these beings even bother? Now, obviously, one of the purposes of these stories within these fables is to demonstrate what is evil and what not to do. But despite the fertile ground for grandstanding about obedience and morality these rebellion stories cultivate, they are at least to some degree an admission of the irresistible urge to defy we all share, no matter how supposedly benevolent the tyranny from which we are rebelling. Melkor's story is no different, and it's even a perhaps more poignant example of rebellion for no good reason than Lucifer's. After all, Yahweh was capriciously malicious and cruel, to the point of making a vengeful, morally ambiguous pagan god like Zeus blush.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Can you really blame Lucifer? And let's consider for a moment here the most important way his insurrection manifested itself. He gave a naked woman and her husband an apple that made them smarter. Hopefully Yahweh was truly unforgiving with all parties involved in that unspeakable act. Whereas Eru, except for his ever so irksome and inconsiderate granting of immortality to one race of his children but not the other, is just about everything you could possibly want from a god. All-powerful, but kind, tolerant, patient, compassionate, all-knowing, and so on. What exactly is Melkor's problem with the wonderful state of affairs Eru has established in Arda? Of course, we are led to believe it's due to some rather human flaws like arrogance and lust for dominion. But what do such things mean, and what place do they have in a limitless and bountiful heaven setting or a Garden of Eden? Why think this way? Why introduce difficulties to a flawless world where all your wants and needs are granted and met? At least part of the explanation is we all share an atheistic, or an anti-authoritarian if you prefer, instinct to defy control of any kind. Even, or perhaps especially, the benevolent rule of a divine creator. At least part of Melkor's message to Eru is, I revoke your supreme status and majesty over me. How dare you assume inescapable threat or extreme kindness would buy my subservience, Mr. Almighty One? And make no mistake, even if we had evidence for God or gods in our own world, which we do not, despite ridiculous claims to the contrary, some of us, myself included, would still remain anti-theist, though we obviously might have to admit to an existence which makes standard atheism untenable. We would still reject any right this being made to ownership of or authority over our lives and aspirations, and vehemently interrogate whatever evidence was presented. In the Silmarillion, Melkor may not be doing so in a logical, praiseworthy manner, but he's still doing so. And his story would be boring if we didn't all enjoy, to a significant degree, this rather epic monkey-wrenching on his part. Now, religious people quite predictably will argue that this is an admission on the part of an atheist that there is some inherent evil in atheism, when in fact such claims on their part reveal a closed mind crippled by black and white thinking. Questioning authority may not always lead to good times and prosperity, but never questioning it, especially when it is presented as sacred and beyond reproach, will take us all to even darker places. Melkor's rebellion represents so much more than just a serendipitous opportunity to enrich a supreme being's erstwhile designs in ways unforeseen by anyone besides the Almighty himself. Now, if I haven't sold you completely on that notion, consider the flip side of Melkor's uprising, the Valar's response to it, because it offers atheists something else to hang their hats on.
Manwë and Melkor were brethren in the thought of Iluvatar. The mightiest of those Ainur who came into the world was in his beginning Melkor. But Manwë is dearest to Iluvatar and understands most clearly his purposes. He was appointed to be, in the fullness of time, the first of all kings, lord of the realm of Arda, and ruler of all that dwell therein, Melkor. Great might was given to him by Iluvatar, and he was coeval with Manwë. In the powers and knowledge of all the other Valar he had part, but he turned them to evil purposes, and squandered his strength in violence and tyranny. For he coveted Arda, and all that was in it, desiring the kingship of Manwë, and dominion over the realms of his peers.
When the Ainur reject Melkor's demand to rule Arda, they are espousing something akin to modern democratic and secular ideals. After all, why not allow the mightiest to reign if ideals of equality and self-government are not guiding your reasoning? Their response to his authoritarian pronouncement is that might alone will not have the final word. They all contributed to Arda's design, and therefore none among them has sole claim to or mastery over it, or those who dwell within it. Sound familiar? Now, it's not exactly a declaration of no taxation without representation or anything like that, but it is a demand that all voices be heard and accorded respect rather than subjugated. Of course, order is respected every bit as much as equality, so Manwë is appointed king, whether by Eru or the Valar themselves, Tolkien doesn't indicate. But really, where the appointment originates is not terribly important, because it certainly seems to be the case that if the Valar were not satisfied with Manwë's leadership, they would reject him, just like they did Melkor. It speaks volumes that the divine beings of Tolkien's world choose a more modern-minded system of governance where counterproductive and whimsical tyranny is not accepted, rather than, like Michael and Gabriel and the other angels in Christianity, explicitly endorse arbitrary and brutal decrees and domination. Although my favorite character in the Silmarillion, for reasons of even temperament, introspection, internal doubt, conflicted allegiance and the resulting unjust betrayal, and finally egalitarian self-sacrifice for a weaker race is Finrod Felagund, I truly enjoy the scenes with Fëanor. I feel he represents an admission, perhaps unwitting, on Tolkien's part, that deep inside him there was great doubt regarding his Catholic beliefs. Fëanor, after all, manages to challenge just about every rule loyal followers of Eru should accept at face value and follow outright, and to defy just about every mightier and more majestic being with a seeming right to rule over him. Yet he is not strictly evil, though many of his actions certainly were. Though it can be argued he is a fallen or tragic hero, he and his works are still celebrated to great degree long after his death, even in the time of Frodo and the Fellowship. So there must be more to him and his legend than just the misery resulting from his oath and his deeds. His letter system is still used at the time of the War of the Ring. His Palantir are sought after and battled for. His greatest works, the Silmaril, still inspire art, poetry, and song. And one shines high above everyone in the evening sky. And that war over the ring? Well, that can in large part be attributed to powerful artifacts created by one of his descendants. In effect, history is repeating itself in the Second and Third Ages, and Sauron is merely restating the same old claim of Melkor's to an a priori supernal mastery over others. And Celebrimbor and the Elven Smiths of Eregion, and pretty much the entire populace of Middle-earth, are simply rebuking it, like the Valar or Fëanor before them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So let's get back to some passages where Fëanor's unrepentant defiance reveals a rather pleasingly cavalier attitude toward divine authority, and where I get the sense that Tolkien took as much delight in writing them as the rest of us do in reading them.
In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king, in Tirion upon the crown of Tunar, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved. Curufinwë was his name. But by his mother he was called Fëanor, Spirit of Fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Miriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinda, because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework. For her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. But in the bearing of her son, Miriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of living. Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. Finwë was sad, for it seemed an unhappy chance that the mother should depart and miss the beginning at least of the childhood days of her son. It is indeed unhappy, said Miriel, and I would weep, if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after.
Even the circumstances of Fëanor's birth are unusual and an insult to the sacred. But to find out why, we need a little digression here. With only this brief Silmarillion passage to work with, the reader would be forgiven for an inability to choose between two equally likely possibilities that Tolkien might be suggesting here. Either Fëanor's great spirit is the result of the will of Eru, or an accidental consequence of his worldly designs, and therefore Miriel is merely an unfortunate victim of circumstances beyond her control, to put it mildly, or she managed on her own to will an unnatural amount of her strength and energy into her son. And it's only by reading of the laws and customs among the Eldar from Morgoth's Ring that anyone would get a clue, which is more likely the case. Here's the passage, the telling bit. It is said that Miriel answered Mondos, saying, I came hither to escape from the body, and I do not desire ever to return to it. My life is gone out into Fëanor, my son. This gift I have given to him whom I loved, and I can give no more. Beyond Arda this may be healed, but not within it. That clarification, I argue, is fairly critical to our understanding of Fëanor's exceptional birth, and more importantly, what it means for discovering ideals of non-belief within Tolkien's writing. The elves are at the peak of their glory, in the bliss of the Holy Realm, and Miriel feels, for some unknown reason, the need to infuse her son with so much unnecessary life force, she dies as a consequence. Now, there are some interesting parallels here to the strange ways in which Christianity deals with childbirth, or does not deal with it and its realities. We almost have a fusion here of the Curse of Eve and the Immaculate Conception, in that Miriel attempts to bear an exceptional child, an immaculate child, shall we say, and as a consequence pays a price as great or greater than Eve did for biting the apple. But more importantly for the purposes of this video, she has defied the goodwill of Eru and the Valar, and determined that heavenly paradise, Valinor, just ain't quite cutting it for her son. Living amid perfection is not good enough. He must himself be perfect.
And Fëanor grew swiftly, as if a secret fire were kindled within him. Few ever changed his course by counsel, none by force. It came to pass that Melkor, as the Valar had decreed, completed the term of his bondage, dwelling for 3 ages in the duress of Mandos alone. Now in his heart Melkor most hated the Eldar, both because they were fair and joyful, and because in them he saw the reason for the arising of the Valar and his own downfall. Therefore, all the more did he feign love for them and seek their friendship, and he offered them the service of his lore and labour in any great deed that they would do. The Vanya indeed held him in suspicion, for they dwelt in the light of the trees and were content, and to the Teleri he gave small heed, thinking them of little worth, tools too weak for his designs. But the Noldor took delight in the hidden knowledge that he could reveal to them, and some hearkened to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. Melkor indeed declared afterwards that Fëanor had learned much art from him in secret, and had been instructed by him in the greatest of all his works. But he lied in his lust and his envy, for none of the Elderlier ever hated Melkor more than Fëanor, son of Finwë, who first named him Morgoth. And snared though he was in the webs of Melkor's malice against the Valar, he held no converse with him and took no counsel from him. For Fëanor was driven by the fire of his own heart only, working ever swiftly and alone. And he asked the aid and sought the counsel of none that dwelt in Aman, great or small, save only, and for a little while, of Nerdanel the wise, his wife.
And so now Tolkien has set down for his readers some rather solid groundwork for Fëanor's subsequent unyielding defiance of the heavenly setting he finds himself in, and its godlike inhabitants.
Thus with lies and evil whisperings and false counsel, Melkor kindled the hearts of the Noldor to strife. For Fëanor now began openly to speak words of rebellion against the Valar, crying aloud that he would depart from Valinor back to the world without, and would deliver the Noldor from thraldom if they would follow him. Then there was great unrest in Tirion, and Finwë was troubled, and he summoned all his lords to council. But Fingolfin hastened to his halls and stood before him, saying, "King and father, wilt thou not restrain the pride of our brother, Finwë, who is called the Spirit of Fire all too truly?" But even as Fingolfin spoke, Fëanor strode into the chamber, and he was fully armed, his high helm upon his head, and at his side a mighty sword. And at the door of the king's house he stayed him, and the point of his bright sword he set against Fingolfin's breast. "See, half-brother," he said, "this is sharper than thy tongue. Try but once more to usurp my place and the love of my father, and maybe it will rid the Noldor of one who seeks to be the master of thralls." But now the deeds of Fëanor could not be passed over, and the Valar were angered and dismayed. And he was summoned to appear before them at the gates of Valmar, to answer for all his words and deeds. And Mandos said to him, Thou speakest of thraldom. If thraldom it be, thou canst not escape it. For Manwë is king of Arda, and not of Aman only, and this deed was unlawful, whether in Aman or not in Aman. Therefore this doom is now made. For 12 years thou shalt leave Tirion, where this threat was uttered. In that time take counsel with thyself, and remember who and what thou art. But after that time this matter shall be set in peace, and held redressed if others will release thee. Then Fingolfin said, I will release my brother. But Fëanor spoke no word in answer, standing silent before the Valar. Then he turned and left the council, and departed from Valmar.
And so we learn here that, rather understandably, Fëanor's independence is not completely impervious to lies and deceit. Melkor is, of course, the mightiest among the lords of the West, so his powers of persuasion are going to be, well, persuasive. However, Melkor quickly learns, like his more noble-minded brethren, that his supernatural existence and abilities don't mean quite as much to Fëanor as he might prefer.
It is told that for a time Melkor was not seen again in Valinor, nor was any rumour heard of him, until suddenly he came to Formenos and spoke with Fëanor before his doors. Friendship he feigned with cunning argument, urging him to his former thought of flight from the trammels of the Valar. And he said, Behold the truth of all that I have spoken, and how thou art banished unjustly. But if the heart of Fëanor is yet free and bold, as were his words in Tirion, then I will aid him, and bring him far from this narrow land. For am I not Valar also? Yea, and more than those who sit in pride in Valimar. And I have ever been a friend to the Noldor, most skilled and most valiant of the people of Arda. Now Fëanor's heart was still bitter at his humiliation before Mandos, and he looked at Melkor in silence, pondering if indeed he might yet trust him so far as to aid him in his flight. And Melkor, seeing that Fëanor wavered, and knowing that the Silmarils held his heart in thrall, said at the last, Here is a strong place and well guarded. But think not that the Silmarils will lie safe in any treasury within the realm of the Valar. But his cunning overreached his aim, his words touched too deep, and awoke a fire more fierce than he designed. And Fëanor looked upon Melkor with eyes that burned through his fair semblance, and pierced the cloaks of his mind, perceiving there his fierce lust for the Silmarils. Then hate overcame Fëanor's fear, and he cursed Melkor and bade him begone, saying, Get thee gone from my gate, thou jail-crow of Mandos. And he shut the doors of his house in the face of the mightiest of all the dwellers in Ea.
Consider carefully how Tolkien chose to word that last sentence, because I'm certain he did. In the face of the mightiest of all the dwellers in Ea. Not the cruelest, the most immoral, or the most evil, the mightiest. And then consider that, in the real world, adherents of monotheism name their god the Almighty. It is power and supremacy alone, not evil, that Fëanor flouts.
Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth. And they came before the green mound Ezoloha. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounding them deep. And their sap poured forth as it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and going then from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds till they were drained. And the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them root, branch, and leaf, and they died. And still she thirsted, and going to the wells of Varda, she drank them dry. But Ungoliant belched forth black vapours as she drank, and swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. So the great darkness fell upon Valinor. Yavanna spoke before the Valar, saying, "The light of the trees has passed away, and lives now only in the Silmarils of Fëanor. Foresighted was he. Even for those who are mightiest under Iluvatar, there is some work that they may accomplish once, and once only. The light of the trees I brought into being, and within Ea I can do so never again. Yet had I but a little of that light, I could recall life to the trees ere their roots decay, and then our hurt should be healed, and the malice of Melkor be confounded." Then Manwë spoke and said, "Hearest thou, Fëanor, son of Finwë, the words of Yavanna? Wilt thou grant what she would ask?" There was long silence, but Fëanor answered no word. Then Tulkas cried, "Speak, O Noldo, yea or nay. But who shall deny Yavanna? And did not the light of the Silmarils come from her work in the beginning?" But Arda, the Maker, said, "Be not hasty. We ask a greater thing than thou knowest. Let him have peace yet a while." But Fëanor spoke then and cried bitterly, "For the less, even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only. And in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain. First of all the Eldar in Aman." "Not the first," said Mandos. But they did not understand his word, and again there was silence, while Fëanor brooded in the dark. It seemed to him that he was beset in a ring of enemies, and the words of Melkor returned to him, saying that the Silmarils were not safe if the Valar would possess them. "And is he not Valar as they?" said his thought. "And does he not understand their hearts? Yea, a thief shall reveal thieves." Then he cried aloud, "This thing I will not do of free will. But if the Valar will constrain me, then shall I know indeed that Melkor is of their kindred." Then Mandos said, "Thou hast spoken."
Obviously, the lies of Melkor continue to pollute Fëanor's thought processes here, but those previous corrupt suggestions be damned, because who among us, when surrounded by our betters, now, our betters aren't supernatural beings with incredible powers, right? So who among us would not feel intimidated and unfairly beleaguered in this situation? Evil is, once again, not Fëanor's chief concern. Instead, he is primarily recoiling from the preeminence of the Valar. I mean, just think of the level of determination and defiance Fëanor displays here. The Lords of the West, the Valar, went out of their way to make the world, all but cleanse it of the devil's evil, for lack of a better term, just so the elves could thrive within it, and all they ask in return is for 3 gems to be sacrificed in order to restore all existence to its previous splendor. And Fëanor cannot be bothered.
There came messengers from Formenos, and they were Noldor and bore new tidings of evil. For they told how a blind darkness came northward, and in the midst walked some power for which there was no name, and the darkness issued from it. But Melkor also was there, and he came to the house of Fëanor, and there he slew Finwë, king of the Noldor, before his doors, and spilled the first blood in the blessed realm. For Finwë alone had not fled from the horror of the dark. And they told that Melkor had broken the stronghold of Formenos, and taken all the jewels of the Noldor that were hoarded in that place, and the Silmarils were gone. Then Fëanor rose, and lifting up his hand before Manwë, he cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, the black foe of the world, and by that name only he was known to the Eldar ever after. And he cursed also the summons of Manwë, and the hour in which he came to Taniquetil, thinking in the madness of his rage and grief, that had he been at Formenos, his strength would have availed more than to be slain also, as Melkor had purposed. Then Fëanor ran from the Ring of Doom, and fled into the night, for his father was dearer to him than the light of Valinor, or the peerless work of his hands. And who among sons of elves or of men have held their fathers of greater worth?
Fëanor's defiance of his divine rulers is pretty much explicit at this point in the story, so I won't belabor the point. I just want to highlight one last instance of it before moving on.
But even as the trumpet sang and Fëanor issued from the gates of Tirion, a messenger came at last from Manwë, saying, "Against the folly of Fëanor shall be set my counsel only. Go not forth, for the hour is evil, and your road leads to sorrow that ye do not foresee. No aid will the Valar lend you in this quest, but neither will they hinder you. For this ye shall know, as ye came hither freely, freely shall ye depart. But thou, Fëanor, Finwë's son, by thine oath art exiled. The lies of Melkor thou shalt unlearn in bitterness. Valar he is, thou sayest. Then hast thou sworn in vain, for none of the Valar canst thou overcome now, or ever within the halls of Ea, not though Eru, whom thou namest, had made thee thrice greater than thou art." But Fëanor laughed, and spoke not to the herald, but to the Noldor, saying, "So, then will this valiant people send forth the heir of their king alone into banishment with his sons only, and return to their bondage? But if any will come with me, I say to them, is sorrow foreboded to you? But in Aman we have seen it. In Aman we have come through bliss to woe. The other now we will try, through sorrow to find joy or freedom at the least." Then turning to the herald, he cried, "Say this to Manwë Sulimo, High King of Arda. If Fëanor cannot overthrow Morgoth, at least he delays not to assail him, and sits not idle in grief. And it may be that Eru has set in me a fire greater than thou knowest. Such hurt at the least will I do to the foe of the Valar, that even the mighty in the Ring of Doom shall wonder to hear it. Yea, in the end they shall follow me. Farewell." In that hour, the voice of Fëanor grew so great and so potent that even the herald of the Valar bowed before him as one full answered, and departed.
Fëanor resists divine control at almost every turn, and it can be argued that Arda is a better place for it. Unlike in our world, where religions consider eating magical intelligence-granting fruit an unforgivable offense that condemns you, your naive husband, and all your descendants for all eternity, disobeying the Valar, in multiple and far more egregious ways, lands you face to face with a simple choice: heaven or earth. The elves are not threatened with the eternal torments of hell like people in the real world. They end up facing something similar in their war with Melkor, but that is due to oaths they made freely themselves. Eru and the Valar were not responsible for them facing perpetual, relentless hostilities with the Dark Lord. They chose that on their own. Fact is, Fëanor's satisfying rejection of divine influence is far from unique among the children of Iluvatar. But rather than highlight more individual examples, let's allow this passage from the Silmarillion to have the final word on the subject. While you listen, contrast it in your mind with the draconian dealings Yahweh has with the people of the Old Testament.
And if ever in their dealings with elves and men the Ainur have endeavored to force them when they would not be guided, seldom has this turned to good, howsoever good the intent.
Here's a quick item getting us back to my favorite character, Finrod. First among the elves to encounter men, he very easily could have used their naivete against them to pass himself off as a god or something more than he was, and thereby take advantage of them for his own benefit.
Then Felagund, standing silent in the night shadow of the trees, looked down into the camp, and there he beheld a strange people. Now these were a part of the kindred and following of Beor, the Old, as he was afterwards called, a chieftain among men. After many lives of wandering out of the east, he had led them at last over the Blue Mountains, the first of the race of men to enter Beleriand. And they sang because they were glad, and believed that they had escaped from all perils, and had come at last to a land without fear. Long Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart. But he remained hidden in the trees until they had all fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people, and sat beside their dying fire where none kept watch. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him. Thus it was that men called King Felagund, whom they first met of all the Eldar, Gnome, that is, wisdom in the language of that people, and after him they named his folk Gnomin, the wise. Indeed, they believed at first that Felagund was one of the Valar, of whom they had heard rumour that they dwelt far in the west, and this was, some say, the cause of their journeying. But Felagund dwelt among them, and taught them true knowledge, and they loved him.
Taught them true knowledge. Gosh, I wonder if there's a lesson there for people passing themselves off as something they're not in the real world. Did I mention Finrod was my favorite character? Like many mythologies, the Silmarillion has its great floods. Several, actually, where the lands are permanently changed. Here are a couple of examples.
The might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of the trumpets of Eonwe filled the sky, and Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms. For the host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. The meeting of the hosts of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle and the War of Wrath. There was marshalled the whole power of the throne of Morgoth, and it had become great beyond count, so that Anfauglith could not contain it, and all the north was aflame with war. So great was the fury of those adversaries that the northern regions of the western world were rent asunder, and the sea roared in through many chasms, and there was confusion and great noise. And rivers perished or found new paths, and the valleys were upheaved, and the hills trod down, and Sirion was no more. And a host of the Númenóreans encamped in might about Tunar, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world. And a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. And all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the forgotten until the last battle and the day of doom. Then suddenly fire burst from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all its children and its wives, and its maidens and its ladies proud. and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its law, they vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tar Miriel the Queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls.
All of this is some rather biblical, end-of-the-world sounding stuff, where the Valar and Eru demonstrate their frightening, earth-rending might and wrath. But there's one essential difference between these stories and the Great Flood in the Bible. It's the part of the story that, unsurprisingly, children never seem to be told. Unlike Yahweh, neither the Valar nor Eru at any time declare that all the children of Iluvatar are so worthless they must be drowned and killed, every last one. In fact, there is no mention of anyone dying from the flood after the War of Wrath at all. And Eru's fury with Numenor is specifically targeted for Numenorians alone. The creator in Tolkien's stories never determines that each and every last one of us, people he created, need to be eliminated. He never says, I made you flawed, but now I'm going to make you pay the price for my intentional incompetence. As I mentioned before, the Silmarillion reads like scripture at times, but The Lord of the Rings, not so much. There are no churches or temples, no holy books, no sermons or days of worship. Hardly a single prayer is recited by anyone except maybe Frodo calling out to Elbereth when confronted by ringwraiths at the Fort of Bruinen, and maybe Gandalf and Galadriel speaking with reverence of the West and returning to it. Now, to be sure, there are supernatural and divine acts happening fairly regularly, but I'll get to them later. Interestingly, even in the Silmarillion, the only ones who seem to build formal houses of worship are the evil ones, Sauron and Melkor's other disciples. Also quite fascinating, to me at least, is the fact that these institutions practice ritualistic slayings and drenching their altars in blood. Not unlike the traditions of human and animal sacrifice found in pagan and monotheistic religions in our world.
But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill, in the midst of the city of the Númenóreans, Amenalos the Golden, a mighty temple. And it was in the form of a circle at the base. And there the walls were 50 feet in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across the center. And the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome, and that dome was roofed all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen afar off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black. For there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a louver, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth. And it crackled and was consumed. But men marveled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased. And in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release them from death. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims.
It's intriguing, to me at least, that Tolkien made the choice to relegate ritualistic sacrifice, something that became regular accepted practice in the real world after religious uprisings and power grabs like the Maccabee Revolution, and once societal power gets returned to priests. It's interesting that he passes this shameful custom onto the corrupt and evil antagonists of his tale. I'll stick my neck out here and assert that Tolkien was not oblivious to pagan and monotheistic history. Nor was he oblivious to the implications of incorporating such a transfer of a repugnant behavior in its stories. And I hate to blindside everyone with what will surely be a rather dark and disturbing realization in an otherwise unassuming video, but if you think religion is now completely past this despicable practice, think again. In the real world, we atheists have become veritable pull-string toys of unbelief. That's right, pull-string toys of unbelief. Hey, somebody should make a movie about it. We get called shrill quite often for constantly repeating the same demand. Where is your proof? If religious people could provide convincing, and that's the key word, convincing evidence, we atheists would rip the pull strings out ourselves and stop asking. No, seriously, we would. Given the arbitrary cruelty of the God of Abraham, we may not like what his proven existence means for all of us, but make no mistake, we'd all be completely captivated by verifiable proof. And maybe that's the understatement of all eternity. And no, the Bible says is not the verifiable proof we're looking for. It's not verifiable at all. Sorry it doesn't work that way, but it doesn't. Whether they realize it and wish to admit to it or not, this is exactly the demand that fantasy authors like Tolkien are satisfying when they create a fictional world like Middle-earth, absolutely dripping with compelling evidence for the existence of the supernatural and for God. The Valar actually do make great lamps and magical light-giving trees. The hallowed Silmarils actually do burn and permanently scar Melkor's evil hands. Ungoliant actually does grow to monstrous size. Sauron actually does turn into a werewolf and then a vampire. Luthien actually does weave a spell in the depths of Angband that puts all the evil ones there to sleep, including Melkor. A Silmaril actually does get added to the firmament. Eru actually does drown Numenor and remake the world, subtracting heaven or Valinor from it. The Ring actually does make Gollum, Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam all invisible. The Balrog really is an evil demon of flame there for all to see in Moria. Gandalf actually does rise from the dead after his battle with the Balrog, or at least survives a plunge into the abyss that no mere mortal could. The Mirror of Galadriel actually does provide visions. Everyone actually witnesses Aragorn commanding the dead, and so on. Ironically, fantastic worlds are precisely the kind of realities we'd all inhabit if the atheists' one emphatic demand could be met. I guess that's why they're fantastic, huh? This next item is more of a fatal flaw in the text, as I see it anyway, an internal inconsistency that afflicts mythologies in the real world as well. Monotheistic religions, and really all religions, suffer from a little logical difficulty they don't like to own up to very often, and that is, if God created everyone, who the heck created God? This is called the infinite regress. Because once you determine the entity that created God, now you've simply made another problem for yourself. Who or what created the being that created God, and so on. Religious people in the real world simply engage in some rather vigorous hand-waving or special pleading to attempt to wiggle and squirm their way out of this inescapable trap, and followers of Eru in Middle-earth would have to do the same. Imagine Frodo asking Gandalf, "Yeah, sure Gandalf, but who created Eru?" Consider for a moment what dismissal of Yahweh or Eru's common sense antecedents really is. It's a form of atheism, because atheism, in its simplest expression, is the rejection of God or gods. And that's exactly what religious people in the real world, or even a fictional one where a deity's existence and intervention is palpable, must do in order to disavow the logic of the infinite regress. They must reject all the creators that would have to precede the one they clumsily insist didn't have a creator. Or as Christopher Hitchens might phrase it, As previously mentioned, if Arda were real and you lived there, you'd have a really tough time denying the compelling evidence for Eru's existence. But even with that being the case, if there were a cult far off in the east of Middle-earth, say, that believed Radavuli Ure created Eru Iluvatar, could you or Aragorn or Galadriel prove otherwise? What proof could you offer these people that Lord Radavuli is just a myth? Hint, it's the same proof Jews or early Christians were able to offer the Romans that Jupiter didn't exist, or that modern believers can offer us that Russell's teapot doesn't exist. That is to say, none. And another sect in the south thinks a legion of omnipotent spiders spun out a web of eternal void from which Lord Radavuli, who created Eru, was born. In other words, even in a fictional world, where a certain number or a set of supernatural beings are said to be real and the evidence for that is manifest, there could be more. The existence of one god doesn't automatically preclude the existence of others. In fact, it kind of implies the exact opposite. Why wouldn't it? If one mythical being can exist, then what's stopping others from existing? It could be turtles all the way down, and how could a fictional story or the characters within it produce convincing evidence to the contrary? As fans, we tend to instinctively preserve a coherent narrative in our heads as we read, so ideas like this hardly if ever occur to us, and we generally immediately reject them if they do, but we don't necessarily have the right to do so. When you think about The Lord of the Rings, science probably isn't the first idea that comes to mind. But if you pay careful attention while reading The Fellowship, Tolkien uses accurate moon phases to indicate that the land of Lorien or Lothlorien is unusual even for his fantastic world. Rather than me explain it, however, here's Dr. Pamela Gay, an astronomer and host of Astronomy Cast.
And my favorite random getting the science right when no one necessarily would ever have noticed is in the Lord of the Rings books, including the Silmarillion. They get the phases of the moon, they get the constellations. All of it is accurate. And so when you go through and you look at how long did it take them to get from place to place as the phases of the moon change, it's correct. They describe the constellation Orion. And there was no reason that that had to be correct. But Tolkien went to that extra step to add authenticity to Middle-earth.
Tolkien got a considerable amount of grief from feminists during the 60s and 70s, at the height of his fame and popularity, for the unforgivable crime of not including enough female characters in The Lord of the Rings. And the same crap goes on today. The idea being, I guess, not only does every novel have to kowtow to feminism, but it has to meet the standards of one specific version of feminism that somehow magically determines through some arcane feminist equations and formulas when the proper levels of estrogen have been reached in your writing. Considering when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, the mid-20th century, and considering its approximate milieu, medieval times, you might think he'd get ample feminist credit for strong female characters like Galadriel and Éowyn. After all, thrust Éowyn into any of the vignettes found in the Torah, Bible, or Quran, and the damn books might ignite in your hands. And of course, frustratingly enough, at the same time, religious and literary critics dismiss Tolkien as some kind of radical counterculture hippie feminist. So, predictably enough, he gets it from both sides, and of course he can win no matter what he does. But again, considering the time and setting of the writing, you really should be impressed with the balance he struck. Yet someone like Quentin Tarantino makes a film like Reservoir Dogs 50 years later with a much more modern setting, obviously, and I'm a fan of the movie, by the way, but he gets basically zero grief for having zero female characters in the film. In fact, he turns into a rising Hollywood star afterward. People, People and their irritating tunnel vision and selective outrage, I tell ya. I'll go ahead and wrap up this video now with a segment from the Fellowship of the Ring that conveys what I feel is one of the most important, if not the most important lesson of atheism, and the best argument why we atheists can in fact claim the moral high ground. And like Manwë relinquishing his kingship over Arda and letting Eru handle Numenor's revolt, I'm going to let Dr. Ted Sherman, someone who has forgotten more about Tolkien's works than I'll ever know, begin the explanation of why it is vital to not only the Lord of the Rings, but to each and every one of us here in the real world as well.
Frodo, I wish it need not have happened in my time. Well, who doesn't wish that? When the shadow grows and takes shape again in their time. Do you really think, Winston Churchill wanted to see Hitler rise and take power? Or Roosevelt wanted to see that happen? Or Truman wanted to see the Soviets gain, the hydrogen bomb? Or wanted to see China invade Korea? Do you really think, Kennedy wanted to see the Vietnam War go the way it did? Or that Bush wanted Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait? I know there are people who say he did. No. Or that Bush too secretly really did want 9/11 to happen? No. Nobody wants those horrible things to happen in their own time. That's why Gandalf says, so do I. And so do all who live to see such times. In other words, this is a natural response. But that's not for them to decide. Right? We don't get to decide if 10 minutes from this next word I'm going to say, just said it, Pet Call suddenly collapses. It could happen. So what do we get to decide? What to do with the time that is given us. That's it.
In other words, we have to make the most of our one crack at this life. We have to make a difference if we can, because what else do we have? There's nothing else left to us after it's all over. Of course, it turns out that ring bearers, spoiler alert, can go to heaven or Valinor, but at this point in the story, we don't know that Frodo has earned this right. Now, notions of the afterlife and who among men, elves, hobbits, and dwarves goes where when they die, and who might get to come back to life and why, can get bewildering pretty quick in Tolkien's universe. But in the real world, espousing this one simple principle is what separates atheists from those who believe in the hereafter. If you think you're going to an eternal paradise when you die, it gives you less, not more reason to live well and honorably in the here and now than believing once the lights go out, that's it. Admittedly, you have to search long and hard for these hints of atheism in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. But I argue they are there, just like they can be found in the most majestic halls of worship in our own world. But let's remember again that one of Tolkien's aims in creating Middle-earth and its tales was to make the first mythology ever written in English, or to recover a quote-unquote lost English mythology if you prefer. So even if you reject all of the points I've raised in this video, that goal alone is subversive enough on its own to serve as the ultimate atheistic point of Tolkien's writing. After all, in a world filled with holy or sacred books, what exactly is the point of drafting another if it's not to challenge their authority?